Under Donald Trump, the U.S. is waging war for oil, and we now have an open-ended plan to potentially run Venezuela, or claim that we are, and a lot of other big problems coming out of what was obviously a dramatic operation to extract and now put on trial what was the leader of Venezuela.
Today, we're reacting to Ari Melber on Trump's Venezuela operation. Melber explains how war for oil went from scandal to Trump just admitting it, but argues the real motive is political distraction. Trump's approval is low, facing bad midterms. His autocratic efforts at home are failing in courts. So he's turning to acts of war where he has unilateral power. Only a third of Americans support this.
But let's just begin with something that Jon Stewart and others pointed out was kind of the joke of all this, that in the Iraq era and other wars, they always denied war for oil. And now Trump just says it. And what was once the scandal is now just the confession, and might makes right is what we're hearing from Trump and Stephen Miller, who I've interviewed, and others. And so let's just take that as a claim. First of all, it doesn't work very well, before you even get into the morality of it, to just try to shake down a country indefinitely for its natural resources. Second, there isn't a lot of evidence that this was very seriously done. Trump has made a big point of saying he talked to the oil companies. But when you dig into this, there's a much longer term set of property rights, energy resources, local diplomacy, business contacts that have to be made if you're going to have a long-term reinvestment of American or foreign companies in Venezuela. As for what's really going on, I actually think when Trump, who's been caught lying more than any other modern official, and we all kind of know that, when Trump starts admitting or claiming he has a rationale, he's not entitled to credibility of other people because he lies so much about so many things. And here he's actually, as usual, gotten a lot of people, myself included, just now mentioning oil to discuss his claimed reason. And he is the president. People are going to refer to that. And in this case, it sounds like a negative or a confession. But when you peel back the layers further, there's a lot of evidence that Donald Trump doesn't have some sophisticated long-term policy for the Caribbean, Latin America, other parts of the world, that this has a lot more to do with how he's doing and his problems in the second term.
Iraq era, everyone denied war for oil. Now Trump just says it. We're taking Venezuela's oil. But Melber argues that's actually a cover for something worse, political distraction. Trump has no long-term plan for Venezuelan oil infrastructure. The Senate already voted 52-47 to block further military action, with some Republicans joining because this is unconstitutional.
He was ending the year with low approval, historically worse than most second-term presidents. A lot of talk about lame duck, rejected by Republicans in the Congress, and that stinging Epstein rebuke. Epstein coverage was a big problem for him. He also lost, of course, the off mid-year elections and is bracing for what even Republicans say could be a bad midterms. And so against that whole backdrop, Donald Trump is going back to what he knows most, not necessarily being the best chief executive officer, but the chief content officer. And other people have pointed this out. I'll just mention from my reporting and what others have written about. When you look, I mean, again, it would be more comical if the stakes weren't so high. When you look at how they were doing the operation that day, they had Twitter open in the room. Trump rushed before Maduro was even back on soil to post that now infamous photo of him in custody. The White House has been more crude and sort of smug in its online posts about this than anything we've seen in the modern era. And a lot of this looks like content. The president, who was ending the year badly and who's bracing for these midterms, is returning to what he thinks works for him, regardless of some larger plan and whether or not they ever get the oil. And I want to put this in a larger perspective. If you remember how we got into January 6th, Donald Trump, from after losing the election, tried a bunch of different things. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to do a Jan 6 rally and then insurrection. There was a fake electors scandal. There was him famously calling and trying to get special sessions of legislators to seal the vote. Some of those calls are on tape. So there were a bunch of different things he tried. And this is his way. Sometimes he actually acts more buffoonish in public while behind the scenes he's doing all these things. And ultimately he landed on Jan 6. Now think about in the second term the level of autocratic efforts he's made. And I say this just following the evidence. This is not to say whether you agree or disagree with every policy idea Donald Trump has or who you voted for. But it's also not to cower and be afraid of someone who's using these autocratic tools to censor. And we've seen that in some corporate media and other places. And so I'm just going to give it to you straight. In the second term, far more than the first, Donald Trump came in and with this sort of shock and awe, tried to do a bunch of things that weren't just skirting the line, but were way over it. And in the short term, some of those things worked, meaning they occurred, and then they were dialed back in the courts. A couple examples you might remember are Elon Musk doing these cuts. A lot of them ultimately, months later, were dialed back in the courts or didn't even save money. He tried to indict opponents. Just looking at some notes I have on this that I wanted to go into in this YouTube. And he's done that with James Comey, with the mayor of Newark, with a member of Congress. That's a big deal, but none of those cases have worked so far.
DOGE cuts got dialed back in courts. Attempts to indict Comey, Eric Adams, and Letitia James failed. Soldiers in streets hit Supreme Court resistance. Every autocratic power grab at home is failing. So what does an unpopular president do? Start a war, because that's where he has unlimited authority and courts won't interfere. Classic wag the dog.
And the case against New York Attorney General James has failed 3 times to even get past the effort to get her indicted. And so that's an autocratic effort that's failing. It may scare some people, it may have some impact, and the law says it's not okay if it's selective prosecution, but that didn't work very well. The DOGE stuff, as I mentioned, petered out. The ICE deportation crackdowns are happening, and we're covering that. In most recent news, a fatal, terrible shooting of an American citizen by an ICE agent in the middle of the day. So that's ongoing as a kind of a show of force, and we've seen Trump, relating to the indictments, also use that kind of federal power to try to intimidate opposition critics, et cetera, Democrats. There were those skirmishes you might remember. He put soldiers in the streets, and that was a big clash, and for several weeks, he was able to have them in the streets, but now he's finding even the Supreme Court full of Republicans is trimming that power, and you can't really have soldiers in the American streets forever. Okay, deep breath. All of those things are running, and most of them aren't working very well for him in the long term. And it's against that backdrop that we start the year in January with this Venezuela operation, where the president does have this kind of authority. We can discuss why it may break the UN Charter, international law, but as a practical matter, and I'll speak to this in part 2, he can do it. That's why he did it. He's doing it. And then he immediately rushes to threaten other countries with no geostrategic framework here. I mean, let's be serious. These are all the things that Trump and some conservatives ran against: the forever wars, regime change, picking these fights, putting America second to these foreign operations. He said it would be America first. He's obviously not doing that. And so, when you actually look at this thing and you just even put aside all the rhetoric and the photographs and the rest of it, some people call it sane washing when there's this effort to try to make a policy out of it. It may not be much of a policy. It may be that Donald Trump, having failed at many of the autocratic efforts I just mentioned, is turning back to something that many unpopular leaders do in many systems of government, including the United States, but he's doing it worse, which is acts of war and saber rattling, because it puts him in charge and it pushes out other issues. Americans don't have any apparent interest in running Venezuela, a country twice the size of Iraq. The Greenland stuff is totally off the wall. It's NATO allies. He's threatening Cuba, a country that presidents of both parties have always tried to lower the temperature with for obvious reasons when it related to the Soviets, Colombia, etc. And so we're watching something that matters, where Donald Trump is unpopular. A lot of what he's failed to do on the autocratic part on the home front is running into those problems or walls that I mentioned. He's bracing for midterms that his own RNC chair says they'll likely lose. I talked to James Carville just this week in the new year, and he was very bullish on that, and we'll see. It's a long time from the New Year's. And so we get this sort of show of force. Now I want to turn briefly to the law. And if you want to simplify it, I'm a lawyer. Law is what governments say it is within their territory. That's why, obviously, when you travel, you have to keep a close eye on what are the rules here or there, not just assume that you have the rights or the due process that you might have in a Western country. And international law is highly debated. It comes out of several sort of bodies of authorities, but there isn't any binding system, of course, other than militaries defending each other's territorial integrity to enforce that. There are criminal courts like the ICC. The U.S. under both parties has never recognized their authority or joined it. And so it is both true but practically not that relevant that Putin breaks the UN Charter, or now President Trump does. And there were many critics of past U.S. policies that said, for example, the Iraq War was a war of aggression. The argument against it by the U.S. was they were claiming that it was defensive, necessary action, but without relitigating all that, there isn't a lot of international law to stop a country in any clear way, unless you have, for example, the UN Security Council and peacekeepers, and we've seen that in some places. So this is against the UN Charter. This is an act of war, and it goes farther, what Trump did in Venezuela, taking the leader out, than other military actions, because you could have drone strikes, which we've had under presidents of both parties, that are designed to take out stateless terrorists or threats. And the message you're sending to that country, if you take out a target or even a potential nuclear site, is we're not trying to have a full war. We don't view this as an act of war, although they might, and this is our defensive measure. But taking out, extracting the head of a foreign government, even one that's very criticized for very good reasons, is an act of war. And obviously the U.S. wouldn't take kindly to it if someone tried it on us or an ally we cared about.
This violates the UN Charter and international law as an act of war. But more importantly, it violates our Constitution. Congress declares war, not the president. The founders designed it this way to prevent exactly this. The War Powers Act requires congressional approval within 60 days. Trump can do the operation initially, but long-term needs authorization.
And that's why you're in this situation where it violates international law, okay, but nothing's going to stop. And then part two, what about our own laws? Remember, the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. And that's very fundamental because all the way back then, the founders were worried about exactly what's happening now, which is a president acting without the informed participation of the country to do things that are like acts of war. And remember, we all know this, but I'll just say, who fights the war? It's the public. It's not like the president or his top people are actually out doing it, although some people in government, of course, even at senior levels, take risks. So that's why we've always had that protection that's in the Constitution. And when this frayed over time, there was also a new law passed you may have heard about, the War Powers Act, which puts extra constraints on even emergency measures. So within 2 months, there's certain things that have to happen. I'm not going to go into all that. But on the domestic front, this looks like the use of war powers or an act of war without Congress. And long term, Congress is supposed to be the representative body that protects the American people. If we're going to have a president like Trump, who's threatening multiple acts of war with multiple countries at once, and the country's going, well, we didn't ask for this, we didn't vote on it, we didn't authorize this force, there you get that tension. But the bad news, if you look at history, and the reason why this is a problem bigger than Trump really, is we don't really have in the United States a mechanism to enforce that. And the Supreme Court has stopped the president. I just mentioned they stopped him and slowed him down on say, soldiers in the streets, or in the first term on the travel ban, or other things. And we've seen even bellicose presidents like Trump then have backed down. And you can't get the whole government to do things, for example, once the Supreme Court says it's unlawful. Even this second term where Trump has been so belligerent, they ultimately brought back a mistakenly deported detainee, Garcia. So unlike those examples, though, to be clear, the Supreme Court doesn't stop or interfere with ongoing wars or war powers. It just doesn't. The closest example you can come to, if you really are interested in going all the way back, was even in a big war that President Truman was overseeing when he tried to seize domestic steel mills in the Youngstown case. That was actually seen as the excess of presidential authority. He said it was for the war, but he didn't have Congress. And basically the court ruled he was acting at the bottom, at the nadir of his power. And even though he said it was for war, they interfered and basically trimmed his powers. But again, that was domestically. When it comes to can you send the soldiers or drop the bomb or do the operation, well, first of all, as you saw in the opening of the year, the president can just do it, and it can be top secret, and there are good reasons for that many times. And the court's not going to come in after the fact, can't reverse it, and they rarely sanction something like that. So that's the situation we're in, and this is one of those breakdowns where some of what I said may sound obvious, although I do think that with all the lying and spinning going on, just keeping the obvious stuff straight might be useful for us. And what Americans have learned about this so far has not endeared them to the Venezuelan operation. Only about a third of people in a recent poll supported it. That could change over time, but usually we see higher support for these things, like even Iraq had high support at first and it fell.
Only a third of Americans support this in week one. Even Iraq started with high support. People see through Trump immediately. MAGA voices like Megyn Kelly saying he ran against this. He campaigned on no regime change, wars then starts one. An unpopular president with autocratic tendencies starting wars for political reasons while facing midterms is the most dangerous recipe in politics.
Here, people are on to Trump. A lot of MAGA voices, Megyn Kelly and others, are saying, well, he said he was against this, and it's kind of like he ran on releasing the Epstein files and then hid them. He ran on no more regime change forever wars and now is actively starting acts of war. And you can come up with other examples. He ran on lowering prices and has struggled to do that. And so cumulatively, we are dealing with a dangerous recipe, an unpopular leader who has no more campaigns to run, who admits totally improper goals like oil and seizing power, and wants to be an autocrat because he's said very publicly he wants to censor free speech. He doesn't want Kimmel and comedians to make fun of him. He wants to use government power to yank them off the air. He wants to sue entities. He doesn't want people like us talking directly on tech or YouTube or other places. And so that's the larger picture. It's not to dramatize it. It's to be clear about the risk. And yet at the same time, if only a third of the country supports this on week one, and people start to get the drift that either this is for something they didn't ask for, running Venezuela to steal oil, or something even less sort of relevant than that, which is that Donald Trump wants to be a tough guy and make content and be perceived that way, you could see further support for this erode. And that matters because even though Donald Trump has tried in the past to steal elections, that's proven in 2020, we have the midterms coming up. We have local authorities that protect that. We have a lot of signs that there's been a total shift away from Trump, which ironically or fittingly is part of this whole dynamic. So those are things I'm watching for as we start the year. And Donald Trump has run 3 presidential races, and he got fewer votes in 2 of them. He got more votes only once in 2020 with all of the spectacular, unusual events we remember from that year. And in the midterms, he's usually done poorly, and we're heading for another midterms. So we are in one of those foreign policy problems where the problem is also feeding, in this case, the politicians' effort to continue it. And the stakes are real and lives are on the line. But there are a lot of reasons to keep your eye on the actual facts and why this could continue to be something where public views, reasonable coverage and evidence, and even a Congress that, while it often disappoints over time, is going to have to look towards November and whether its citizens are saying, yeah, they want to pick fights or start wartime powers with other random countries, or get focused back on solving our problems here at home.